The ocean has a way of balancing the scales, sometimes with waves, sometimes with wrath. But on this fateful morning, it would use something far more powerful, the unbreakable will of those who call the sea their home. Jack Wilson, a weathered fisherman with salt in his veins and calluses on his hands, had no idea that before sunset his life would be shattered, only to be rebuilt by forces he never saw coming. The small coastal town of Seabrook slept under a soft pink dawn, the kind that promised calm waters and a full net. Jack's boots crunched against the weathered dock as he untied the Marlin's Pride, his rusted but reliable fishing boat. To him, she wasn't just wood and nails. She was his father's legacy, his daughter's college fund, and the only home he'd ever known on the water. Yet as the engine sputtered to life, a cold ripple ran down Jack's spine. Maybe it was the unnatural stillness of the gulls watching from the pier, or the distant hum of a motor too sleek, too powerful to belong to any working boat. He shook it off. Just superstition, he told himself. But the sea has its own laws, and today it would demand justice. By noon, the Marlin's Pride would be splinters. By nightfall, Jack would be drowning in despair. But by sunrise, an armada would arrive, and their target wasn't fish, it was revenge. But let's start at the beginning. The morning mist still clung to the water as Jack guided the Marlin's Pride past the no-wake buoys. His hands moved automatically, the motions of baiting lines and checking nets as familiar as breathing. The radio crackled with the usual chatter of fellow fishermen exchanging coordinates and complaining about prices at the docks. A normal day. A good day. Until the roar of twin diesel engines shattered the calm. Jack barely had time to turn before the gleaming white hull of the Opulent sliced through the water like a blade. The wake hit first, a wall of water that sent the Marlin's Pride rocking violently. Then came the sickening crunch as the yacht's prow smashed into the port side. Wood splintered. Ropes snapped. The fishing nets Jack had spent 3 days repairing disappeared beneath the churning water in an instant. On the yacht's upper deck, Richard Kensington barely spilled his mimosa. He leaned over the railing, designer sunglasses glinting in the sun. "You're in my way, old man," he called down, his voice dripping with the bored confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences. Behind him, a group of laughing socialites snapped pictures of the destruction like it was just another tourist attraction. Jack clung to what remained of his wheelhouse, salt water stinging his eyes. "You just destroyed my livelihood," he shouted, his voice raw. The words tasted like bile. 30 years on these waters, and it could all end because some rich bastard couldn't be bothered to watch where he was going. Richard removed his sunglasses with exaggerated slowness. "Should have gotten real insurance, fisherman." The yacht's engines growled back to life. "Or maybe a real job." With that, the Opulent powered away, leaving Jack knee-deep in rising water, surrounded by the floating wreckage of everything he'd worked for. The Coast Guard arrived 20 minutes later. Their report would call it an unfortunate accident. Suggested Jack might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The insurance adjuster who came the next day took one look at the remains of the Marlin's Pride and shook his head. "Acts of God aren't covered, Mr. Wilson. Neither is negligence." That night, Jack sat on his porch staring at the moonlit harbor. The pain in his hands wasn't from the cuts and splinters, it was from clenching his fists too tight. In the distance, he could see the glowing party lights of the Opulent anchored in the bay. Laughter and music carried across the water, salt in his fresh wounds. But the sea remembers, and sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or insurance companies. Sometimes it comes with the tide. Tomorrow's dawn would bring more than sunlight to Seabrook. It would bring reckoning. The diner's bell jangled as Jack pushed through the door, the smell of stale coffee and fried eggs doing nothing to settle the storm in his gut. He slumped into a corner booth, ignoring the sideways glances from the breakfast crowd. Everyone in Seabrook had heard by now. The town's fishermen always did have a way of spreading news faster than the weather radio. "Rough night?" the voice came from across the booth. An old man in a navy peacoat sat stirring his coffee, his hands gnarled like driftwood but steady as a lighthouse beam. Captain Elias, the locals called him, a retired sailor who'd appeared in town a few years back and never left. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just slid the insurance denial letter across the chipped formica table. Elias read it slowly, his bushy white eyebrows knitting together like storm clouds gathering. When he finally looked up, his eyes held the same deep, knowing darkness as the ocean at midnight. "The sea takes care of her own, son," Elias said, pushing the letter back. His voice carried a weight that made the coffee cups tremble. You'll have your justice before the tide turns." Before Jack could ask what he meant, the old man stood, dropping a 20 on the table. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's gonna be a day you'll tell your grandkids about." Dawn broke over Seabrook Harbor with an eerie stillness, the water flat as glass. Jack stood on the dock where the Marlin's pride should have been tied up, his eyes raw from lack of sleep. Then he heard it, a low, throbbing hum in the distance that grew louder by the second. Not the whine of a single engine, but the deep chorus of dozens. One by one, they appeared on the horizon. Fishing trawlers, Coast Guard cutters, even a Navy patrol boat Jack had only ever seen in the news. The armada moved with purpose, their wakes converging as they formed a perfect semicircle around the harbor mouth. At the center, riding the waves like he'd been born on them, stood Captain Elias on the bridge of a refurbished tugboat, his posture straight as a mast, his eyes fixed on the opulent's mooring. From his yacht, Richard Kensington stumbled onto the deck in a silk robe, his face still puffy from last night's champagne. "What the hell is this?" he slurred, squinting at the gathering fleet. His phone was already out, thumb hovering over his lawyer's number, but no lawyer could stop what was coming. The first fishing boat's horn blasted loud enough to rattle windows up and down the coast. Then another, and another. Soon the entire harbor echoed with the sound, not just horns, but voices. Dozens of fishermen, sailors, and dockworkers lining the piers, their shouts carrying across the water like a tidal wave of fury. Jack's knees nearly buckled when he saw the signs. SCABROK stands with Jack painted on weathered plywood. Kensington pays on a bedsheet hanging from a trawler's rigging. Even the Coast Guard cutter had raised a signal flag, the international maritime symbol for "you are in violation." Elias' tugboat pulled up alongside the dock where Jack stood frozen. "Well," the old captain called down, extending a hand. "You coming to collect what's yours?" His smile was sharp as a harpoon. "Turns out I still know a few admirals who remember how to hold a grudge." Richard Kensington's silk robe flapped in the harbor wind as he scrambled down his yacht's gangplank, bare feet slapping against the weathered dock boards. His lawyer's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "Don't say anything. Don't admit fault." But the words barely registered over the blaring horns and shouted demands echoing across the water. The opulent's crew stood frozen at their posts, staring at the wall of ships blocking the harbor mouth. "Let's be reasonable about this," Richard shouted, waving his champagne flute toward the gathered fleet. The golden liquid sloshed over his fingers as his hand trembled. "I'll write a check right now. Name your price, fisherman." His voice cracked on the last word, the polished facade crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Captain Elias stepped forward, his boots steady on the rocking tugboat deck. "This isn't about money, Kensington." He spoke quietly, but every word carried across the silent harbor like a foghorn. "This is about respect, something your kind always seems to forget exists outside your gilded world." The crowd's murmurs grew louder as a black SUV with government plates rolled onto the pier. Two uniformed Coast Guard officers emerged, followed by a stern woman in a navy blazer, the harbormaster, her badge glinting in the morning sun. She surveyed the wreckage photos Jack had taken, then fixed Richard with a look that could sink ships. "Mr. Kensington, your vessel's GPS data shows you were doing 22 knots in a 5-knot zone. Care to explain?" Richard's mouth opened and closed like a stranded fish. His eyes darted to his yacht where party guests peered through the portholes, their phones recording everything. "There must be some mistake," he blustered. "My crew handles navigation, I just—" "On the boat," the harbor master finished for him, flipping open a citation book. "Which makes you legally responsible. Reckless operation of a watercraft, destruction of property, failure to render aid." Each charge landed like an anchor chain across Richard's shoulders. "We're impounding the opulent pending investigation." A cheer erupted from the gathered fishermen, but Elias held up a hand for silence. "Not so fast." He turned to Jack, who stood gripping the tugboat's railing, his knuckles white. "This man deserves his say first." Jack stepped forward, the weight of every eye in the harbor pressing down on him. For a moment he saw his father's face reflected in the water, the man who taught him to mend nets before he could ride a bike. When he spoke, his voice didn't shake. "That boat was all I had left of my dad. You didn't just break wood, Kensington. You broke a promise." The silence that followed was deeper than the ocean trench. Even the gulls stopped crying. Then a new sound cut through, the whine of hydraulics as a crane on the nearest cargo ship swung to life, lowering a massive net into the water beside the opulent. Elias grinned. "Seems the Port Authority remembers me after all. That's a salvage net, Kensington. And unless you want your pretty toy crushed like a beer can, I suggest you start talking real compensation. Richard's face went the color of spoiled milk as the net's cables creaked ominously. He turned to Jack, all pretense of arrogance gone. Name your terms. The deal was struck as the morning tide rolled in full restitution for the Marlin's pride, plus punitive damages paid directly from Richard's offshore accounts. The harbormaster made sure of that, her pen scratching across the paperwork with grim satisfaction. By noon, news crews had arrived, their cameras capturing Richard being escorted off his beloved yacht in handcuffs while the crowd sang sea shanties. But the real victory came as the fleet began dispersing. One by one, each fishing boat sounded its horn in salute as it passed Jack standing on the dock. The last to leave was Elias Tugg, the old captain tipping his hat as he steered toward open water. "Remember, son," he called over the diesel rumble, "the sea provides, but only to those willing to fight for her." Jack watched until the tug disappeared around the headland, then turned back to the harbor. The opulent sat tethered to the Coast Guard dock, its polished chrome dull under the gray sky. Somewhere beneath the waves, the splintered remains of the Marlin's pride still drifted. But for the first time since the crash, Jack felt something other than anger, the first faint stirrings of hope, rising like a tide. The hammer's rhythmic clang echoed across Seabrook's shipyard as Jack drove the last bronze nail into the hull of his new boat. The scent of fresh cedar and pine tar mixed with the salt air, while volunteers from up and down the coast sanded railings and coiled ropes. 6 weeks had passed since the opulence impounding, but the town's anger had cooled into something stronger, a quiet determination that flowed through the docks like the turning tide. On the bow, freshly painted in bold navy letters, the name Elias Justice gleamed in the afternoon sun. Jack ran his fingers over the smooth wood, remembering the old captain's last words before he disappeared back into the mist. The boat wasn't as large as the Marlin's pride, but every plank had been laid with care, some from salvaged dock timbers, others from donated oak, a mosaic of the whole coast's generosity. The festival lights strung between the fish market stalls flickered to life as dusk settled over the harbor. Laughter and fiddle music spilled from the crowded docks where the entire town had gathered. Old Man Henderson flipped burgers on his rusted grill, while the Thompson kids raced between tables with stolen slices of blueberry pie. Even the Coast Guard crew had come ashore, their stiff uniforms softened by mugs of dark beer. Mayor Wilkins clanged a spoon against his lemonade glass, the crowd's chatter dying down as he stepped onto the makeshift stage of fish crates. "We're here tonight," his voice boomed, "not just to celebrate a new boat but to remember what makes Seabrook special." A cheer rose up, mingling with the cry of gulls overhead. "When one of us gets knocked down, we don't just help them up, we build them something stronger." Jack felt his face grow warm as every eye turned toward him. He'd never been good with speeches, but as he climbed onto the crates, the words came easy. "This boat belongs to all of you," he said, his calloused hands spread wide. "To the fishermen who donated their winter savings, to the shipwrights who worked dawn till dusk." His voice caught as he spotted his daughter in the front row, her smile brighter than harbor lights. "And to a certain old salt who taught me justice runs deeper than any ocean." The fireworks started just as the first stars appeared, not the fancy city kind, but homemade rockets launched from Pete's lobster boat. Each explosion painted the night sky in shimmering blues and greens, their reflections dancing across the calm harbor waters. Out past the breakwall, the lights of the Coast Guard cutter stood watch over the darkened silhouette of the opulent, its decks empty and silent. Later, as the last guests wandered home and the music faded, Jack sat alone on his new boat's deck. The wood still smelled fresh beneath his palms, the mooring lines creaking gently. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he knew Elias was sailing under these same stars. The thought brought a quiet smile. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the only thing salvaged from the Marlin's pride, his father's rusted compass. The needle trembled, then steadied, pointing true north as always. The sea breeze carried the distant chime of harbor buoys, a lullaby for the waking town. Tomorrow would bring early tides and full nets. There'd be repairs to make and new memories to forge aboard Elias Justice. But for tonight, Jack let himself simply breathe in the salt air, listening to the waves whisper against the hull. The ocean had taken and the ocean had given back. And in Seabrook, that was enough. The morning sun painted the harbor in gold as Elias Justice cut through calm waters, her nets heavy with the season's first catch. Jack stood at the helm, his hands steady on the wheel, the compass his father had left him fixed to the dashboard. The scars of that terrible day were still there, the splintered dock pilings, the faint oil slick where the opulent had once anchored, but the sea, as always, had a way of healing. Because here's the truth about stories like this. They don't end when the credits roll. They ripple outward like waves from a thrown stone. Maybe you've seen injustice like Jack's, someone with power crushing those without. Maybe you've been the one standing in the wreckage, wondering if anyone will ever care. But if this story teaches us anything, it's that courage is contagious. One act of defiance can wake up an entire town. One voice can call in a fleet. So tell me, what would you have done if you'd been on that dock? Would you have stood with Jack? Would you have been the first to sound the horn? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Because next week we're diving into another tale where the little guy fights back, the teacher who graded the school board's corruption and changed an entire town. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, the world is full of Richard Kensingtons, but it's also full of Jack Wilsons and Captain Eliases, and maybe, just maybe, it's full of people like you too, people who refuse to let the powerful forget the tide always comes back in. Like and subscribe for more real-life justice stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Comment below, what's your favorite underdog moment?